amazing turnout. Hello there, my name is Jason Beattie. I'm from the Daily Mirror. I am delighted to be chairing this event for Changing Europe for inviting me. The title of the Fringe is What Does Labour Want from Brexit? Many of you may say, do we want Brexit at all? Then if we do want Brexit, what sort of Brexit do we want? And then probably a more difficult question, if we do have Brexit, what does it mean for Labour and what sort of policies do they do to unite a country which has been divided geographically, it's been divided by age, it's been divided by income, and it's been divided by education on a really difficult issue. And how do you bring it together? How do you bring, I think a lot of our panel want to talk about the gap between the towns and the cities and rural communities. They want to talk about how they build bridges in their own communities. So I'm going to introduce the panel. They're all going to speak for 4 or 5 minutes each, and then we're going to throw it open to general discussion and questions, if that's all right. So I'm going to start...
Can I just add that none of us can see you at the back? You might as well also stand up.
Oh, I'm more than happy to stand up. It's probably a face to radio, but never mind anyway. I did a quick Google on Matt. He now works for a very good campaign called the Campaign for Fairer Gambling. It said other commentators you may like are Isabel Oakeshott, Dan Hodges and Peter Hitchens. So thank God we've got you, is what I can say. Bridget Phillipson, MP for Houghton and Sutherland, South, got it wrong, since 2010, an area which voted by about 65% for Leave. 16% for Leave. Yeah, and you work for a People's Vote campaign, so that's going to be interesting. So Bridget's going to have a lot to say about how she reaches out to her community, how Labour, as I said, bridges that divide. Stephen Kinnock, who has just victoriously won the MPs versus Press football match this morning.
Against Matt, I would hasten to add.
By bringing in a ringer, famous Richard
Fowler. We are.
So as a champion of the free press, really glad Stephen here. Again, Aberavon MP in South Wales, got Port Talbot, post-industrial area, steel, big areas to discuss about how can you have a kind of, a muscular state in a kind of post-Brexit world. If we get to Brexit, of course, because Stephen also is campaigning against Brexit, and he's just written a very interesting book, which I'm going to hold up to him and publicise, called The Spirit of Britain, The Purpose of Labour, which examines in part how the Labour Party can move forward in a post-Brexit Britain, brackets if we get to Brexit. And last but not least, the director of UK Literature Europe, Anand Menon, who probably knows more about Brexit than anybody else I know. So if you have some really techie questions, and I do this all the time, I'm going, I really don't understand this man had explained, and he explained clearly and with great insight. So that's brilliant. So I'm just going to go in this order because Matt has to go a little bit early, so he's not being rude and he's not upset by your questions. He just had another engagement. So we're going to start with Matt. Do kick off 5 minutes, Matt, and I'm tiny.
Thanks very much. Can everyone hear me at the back? Yeah, excellent. Just about. Okay, I'll probably move this then. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, is there one there? Yeah.
Start singing then.
Is that working? Is that
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm Matt Zarb-Cousin. I'm not working. It is. It's coming out. It is. It's coming out now. Okay. There you go. I'm a former spokesperson for Jeremy Corbyn, and I left the job just before the last general election. So I was there when the Brexit referendum happened, and was there in the aftermath, and obviously was involved in formulating Labour's position on that. And I think what's important to bear in mind is my and the Leader's Office opposition to acceptance of the result of the referendum is not ideological. It's essentially boils down to political strategy. And the reason that some of the criticisms that are levelled at Jeremy Corbyn often are, well, he's principled on everything else, why can't he be principled on Brexit? Well, I think it's very difficult in the context of when you've had a referendum to then ignore what the people have said. So I think accepting the result is the correct thing to do, and was the correct thing to do at the last election in that context. But obviously, if you're talking about political strategy and political positioning, the context matters, and the context is always shifting. So what's happened now, because Labour accepted the result of the referendum, and because they haven't taken a position against Brexit. They said, invoke Article 50, get on with the negotiating, and the government have been left to it. And now the government's deal, which they said would be the easiest deal to do in history, and they said that we'd have exactly the same benefits as when we're in the EU to when we leave. They're going to be held to those standards now. They're going to be held to that. And Chequers doesn't deliver that. Chequers doesn't deliver exactly the same benefits. So even if they get the deal that they want to get, Labour will vote against it. At that point, I believe the government will fall, unless Theresa May extends the Article 50 process, and then I think that it's very likely that there'll be a second referendum. But it's difficult to say exactly what questions would be on the ballot paper at that point. But the point I really want to try and make is Labour can't stop Brexit from opposition. It couldn't even get a meaningful vote on the final deal through. I mean, that's how, when it comes down to it, party politics is the most, from the Conservatives' perspective, it trumps everything else. And that's why the so-called Tory rebels voted with Theresa May and with the government when it came to amending the withdrawal bill. They couldn't even get the meaningful vote. So, look, you saw what you may have seen what Dominic Raab had said to Keir Starmer last week. He said, come clean on Labour's Brexit position. Do you want a second referendum or not? You can see that they're already, I mean, this is Dominic Raab, the Brexit secretary, supposed to be negotiating the deal. They're already trying to pin everything on Labour. They're trying to build a narrative about Labour sabotaging Brexit. And they've been unable to build that narrative because Labour have simply not sabotaged. They've just said, get on with it, we'll hold you to the promises that you made about the deal that you would get, and we're going to hold you to account on that. And what's happened as a result of that is the Conservatives haven't been able to blame Labour. They're not able to blame Labour now, their attacks aren't landing, and actually they're going to be held to account more because they're not going to be able to blame the Labour Party for the bad deal that they're going to get, even if they do get a deal. I think if it's no deal, the economic consequences would be so catastrophic for the Conservative Party that it will put them out of power for a generation. Obviously, the country suffers as a result of that, and I just simply do not believe that they would allow that to happen. So in that context, I think it would have to be either an extension of Article 50 and a second referendum, or it would be a general election and then extension of Article 50 and a renegotiation. I just simply don't believe the Conservative Party will allow no deal to happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And within your 5-minute slot, so even better. Thank you very much. Lots to
Turn the microphone off.
I'm not sure the applause was the mat of a person who asked us to turn a microphone up, but it was welcome. Bridget.
Thanks very much. It's great to see so many people here today because I think we're going to spend the next 30 or 40 years talking about Brexit, so we may as well get used to the fact that so much of the discourse around what needs to change in our country will see the life sucked out of it with the focus that there needs to be on how we approach Brexit. I come at this from the belief that in recent years too much of what we've been arguing for has been with a small c conservative argument for the status quo. So in the course of the referendum campaign, we appeared to be on the side of the status quo. Now, in some cases, being on the side of the status quo can be straightforward, it can be right, whether that's arguing to stop a library closure, stop a Sure Start Centre closing, or arguing against some of the changes that are happening in the welfare system. But to just give a short quote there, the historian Tony Judd spoke of the social democracy of fear, of the importance of asserting social democratic values and institutions as bulwarks against an uncertain and bleak future. But that only ever works if it goes hand in hand with something more positive, and that is more limited in what it can achieve when there are more exciting and appealing alternatives elsewhere. And for many of the people that we represent, and for many people in Sunderland, the people that I represent, the achievements of the last Labour government are quickly fading into memory. And in that European referendum, we found ourselves defending the status quo, rather than learning from the issues that we ended up being on the receiving end of following the referendum in Scotland. Twice now, we've been challenged by nationalists peddling easy lies and false promises about a future that they can't deliver. But we also need to offer a vision of hope. And the European Union has done a lot more than deliver lower roaming charges and the fact that you can more easily get on a flight to the continent. Of course, for many of the people that I represent, those are little more than unachievable, unaffordable dreams, and it doesn't really speak to their lives and their challenges. And for too long, we've allowed a transactional approach to define how we approach our politics, whether it's here and whether it's in our attitudes towards Europe. And on the electoral politics of this, and I hope we'll pick up this a bit more in discussion, and I'll talk a bit more in responding hopefully to some of the points that Matt was raising. Those of us who believe that the course that the Tories are charting for our country with Brexit, and the fact that it will make the lives of working people in places like Sunderland far, far harder, need to be unafraid to make that argument and to make it loud and clear. Because in the months since the referendum in 2016, the political debate around Brexit has been aggressive, it's been coarse, and it's sought to dampen down anyone that seeks to put forward an alternative perspective, as if wanting to discuss our future relationship with Europe was somehow anti-democratic or against the will of the people. And that's a pretty dangerous place, I think, that we're heading in as a country if we can't reassess and reevaluate where we're headed. And I also think that those of us who believe that the public should be given the chance to look again at what's on the table need to be unafraid to make that argument with courage and conviction. We've got to stand up and argue for the things in which we believe. Arguing for what we think people want today is no way to win a general election, and the public see it from a mile off. But to win someone over, you don't need to impersonate them, you need to convince them. And if we have a strong enough and a clear enough message, which is both realistic and achievable, about how we'll use government power both in this country and in Europe to make people's lives better, then I believe we can win again. Because none of us believe that the way in which Britain is run today is right. We all want our country to change. And I share the anger of so many people in my community who in June 2016 were asked to endorse the status quo and were told, what exactly is the status quo doing for me and for my life? Almost a third of children in my community grow up in poverty. Wages have never recovered since the financial crash, and life is getting harder for families. Britain has been too unequal a country for too long. That is not going to get any better if we crash out of Europe with a Tory extreme Brexit. But I'm optimistic that people can change their minds and that they will change their minds if we have the courage and determination to argue for what we believe in and from the right values that we hold. Like Matt, I want a Labour government, and I want a general election today and a Labour government today. But I'm not convinced that a general election will solve the problem that we face. We had a general election last year. The Tories lost the majority, they ploughed on regardless. I think we need a people's vote to allow the people to look again at what's on offer and decide if they think it will do anything to help them, to help their lives and to change our communities for the better. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Bridget. I'm now going to hand over to Stephen Kinnock. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thanks to UK and a Changing Europe for organising this and for all the excellent work that you're doing, Anand, and your team, really helping all of us to understand the issues more clearly, which is such an important part of this debate. We've talked a lot about the causes of Brexit, and I think that that is really the question that we have to answer if we need to answer the question that the exam question we've been set today, which is what does Labour want out of Brexit? And that, I think, is a question that goes to the founding purpose of the Labour Party. And the big question that needs to be answered, the issue that needs to be resolved, is the issue of division. Because our country is more divided than it has been in any time in living memory. It's young versus old, it's graduates versus non-graduates, it's city versus town. And in the book that Jason mentioned earlier, we basically say that the country has become two tribes now, a tribe of cosmopolitans and a tribe of communitarians. And that division is becoming so dangerous that I think it is ripping our country apart. And if that is the #1 priority that we have to address, then I think the answers and the rest of this debate that we're having here today has to flow from that. If we are a party that believes in reuniting, in coherence, in harmony, in bringing communities together, in closing the gap and building the bridges between the cosmopolitans and the communitarians, then our answer to Brexit has to flow from that #1 exam question. And the big challenge that I see with the campaign for the People's Vote is that one thing we know it won't do, it won't reunite the country. It will drive yet another wedge between city and town, between young and old, between graduates and non-graduates. And that, I think, is a fundamental question that does need to be answered in terms of how we would run another referendum without further polarisation and ultimately potentially further paralysis. Now, I know that the EU referendum didn't create those divides. Those divides have been building for decades. Decades of failure of political leadership of all stripes to bring our communities together. And of course, this was turbocharged by the global financial crisis in 2008. And of course, the European Union wasn't the cause of any of this. But what people voted for on the 23rd of June 2016 was the fact that, as Bridget absolutely rightly said, why the hell should I vote for the status quo when the status quo isn't working for me? In the absence of a compelling political vision, in the absence of that political leadership, in being told constantly that globalization is just a force of nature, that there's nothing we can do about it, sorry that your jobs are going to China, apologies for the fact that we've opened the doors to mass free movement of labour in 2004, the only country in the European Union to do that. We're just going to ride roughshod over the concerns of those communitarian communities and leave them behind. And what we saw, I'm afraid, in the 2017 general election was a further entrenchment of those divides. Amazing that we won in Canterbury and Kensington, but we lost in Mansfield and North East Derbyshire. Those communitarian heartlands, the people who live in those places are the people the Labour Party was created to represent. So if we're going to be a whole nation party again, if we're going to address this culture war that I think is going on in our country, we have to have a whole nation message. And that will require two things. In the short term, it requires getting the right message and the right policy and the right way on Brexit. And then in the longer term, it's addressing the deep-seated challenges, and so much of that is addressed in the radical economic policies in our 2017 manifesto, and also I think in the IPPR's recent Economic Justice Commission is an absolutely brilliant document that we should be looking to mainstream into our thinking. But on the first point, on Brexit, I've been arguing for 2 years now for a Brexit based on the European Economic Area. I think that with a narrow vote for leave, in my view that reflects that the country wants to leave the political institutions and the political project of the European Union, but retain a close economic relationship. And I think that's something we've seen in all of the feedback from, certainly on the doorstep in my constituency. So many people say to me, look, I voted to join the common market in the 1970s, but the European Union did then become something that I didn't vote for. And we need to recognise there was an integrationist surge after Maastricht, and it left our country behind in terms of democratic consent. There clearly isn't democratic consent for a deeper political integration that you might see in other parts of the European Union. I think you can address the issue of free movement of labour within the European Economic Area. Articles 112 and 113 enable the emergency brake and the suspension of any one of the 4 freedoms. And I think it also does have a different set of institutions such as the EFTA Court. So it enables us to have a reset in our relationship with the European Union, to leave the EU, but without wrecking the British economy, wrecking the jobs and the livelihoods of the people that Labour exists to represent. So my final closing comment would be, we need a Brexit that can reunite our deeply divided country, and then we need the policies based on those areas of life that really matter to people: work, family, community and country. And on that basis, with our manifesto and with some of the great ideas coming out of the IPPR, we can then say what we want out of Brexit is a radical Labour government that will actually change our country for the better. and reunite our deeply polarised country. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And now Anand, who I should say is slightly sceptical of the idea of a second referendum as well.
Well, I mean, I suppose as the academic here, I'm just going to try and pick holes in everything without coming forward with any solutions, because that's the luxury of where I'm coming from. And just on the basis of the things I've heard, I want to say a few things. I mean, firstly, let's be absolutely clear about the fact leaving the European Union will have a negative effect on the British economy. I think it's worth stressing that, because you hear so much nonsense about the fact that actually the prospects are so much better out than in economic terms. It is very, very hard to see that. Simply put, we have teams of economists who do the forecasts on this. If we leave the single market and the customs union, so if we do what Theresa May is talking about, our trade with the EU will fall by of the order of 40% in a decade. And they are our nearest and our biggest trading partner. That cannot but have an impact on our economy. And one of the interesting things, I mean, all this sort of noise and fury that you hear about economic forecasts, is that none of the economic organisations that did forecasting during the referendum about the long-term impacts of Brexit have seen the need to revisit those numbers, because essentially they still think those numbers are true. And those numbers say that our economy, if we leave the single market and the customs union, will be somewhere between 3 and 7% smaller than it would have been had we stayed in. And that's a shock along the area of magnitude of the financial crisis. That's what we're going to have to deal with. So the bottom line is, if Brexit goes ahead along the lines that the Prime Minister seems to want it to, it'll be harder for any government, Labour or Conservative, to do what it wants to do, because there simply isn't going to be as much cash as there would have been. Now, the problem is, there are, at this moment in time, no obvious, easy alternatives. I mean, Stephen talks very compellingly about the Norway option. I have my doubts. I have my doubts simply because it happens occasionally that Jacob Rees-Mogg hits on a point where he might be right. And when he coined the notion of vassal state, there is a danger that that is what Norway turns into. In Norway, however indirectly, you are living under laws over which you have no direct say. Now that works for Norway, and it works for Norway for largely one reason, which is because the issue of Europe is depoliticised in Norway. The issue of Europe is many things in these countries, but depoliticised it is not. And that is to say, as soon as we start living under rules that are made in the European Union where we no longer have a vote, I just find it hard to believe a country like Britain tolerating that politically for long. The danger isn't just one for us. I fear that we'll blow the EEA up by becoming difficult within it as well. So I worry about that on the political front. When it comes to the referendum itself, it's very, very interesting in several ways. I mean, I think, firstly, it is not at all clear to me that there is a groundswell of opinion in favour of a referendum. I mean, if you look at the polling shows that the question matters. If you say to people, do you want another referendum, the reaction tends to be a Brenda from Bristol, which is, oh Jesus, anything but another referendum. If you say in a survey, should the people control the outcome of Brexit, then you'll get a majority saying yes. But the poll findings are very, very contradictory. And actually, when it comes to how people would vote in a referendum, anyone who tells you they're confident we would vote to remain, either because of deaths amongst leavers or whatever else, don't be taken in. We don't know. Pollsters have absolutely no earthly clue who would turn out to vote in another referendum, which means no one knows how it would go. So there's that uncertainty, but there's a political element as well to this. Imagine a second referendum that led to a majority of 52-48 to remain on a smaller turnout than 2016. What does that fix? Very, very little. And actually, for any government to work in a country like this, what you should ultimately want is a country that's prosperous, fair and stable. For me, a second referendum that leads to an outcome like that would lead to many things, but stability it absolutely wouldn't do. And I'd just add, if you think back to the pre-2016 world, which is very hard to do, I know, because so much has happened since, what we worried about when we thought about politics then was political disengagement, public apathy, public distrust in politics. Actually, rerunning the vote for me would be dangerous in the sense it would confirm in the minds of those who were already suspicious what they always thought. Well, we knew they'd find a way to get around this, whatever we voted. Don't know why I wasted my time. And I think that is a real danger for any political system. And it's something the Labour Party in particular should be cautious about. Just finally, what I should say is, For Labour, there's a lot of stuff in the papers this morning about how Labour would sweep an election if they went out in favour of a second referendum. Possibly, but I'm less certain than many pollsters seem to be, simply because of the fact that what counts in electoral politics are marginal seats. Labour has an awful lot of marginal leave seats. And so whilst the party might sweep up Remainer seats in places where it already has healthy majorities, in places like the town I grew up, Wakefield, where the Labour majority has been shrinking steadily, the notion that people would go out and vote for the party in a 70% leave voting town strikes me as slightly optimistic, to say the least. So I worry about the details of the electoral effects. Final point is we shouldn't despair, because ultimately, Brexit or no Brexit, government is what decides what our country and what our economy looks like. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation did a brilliant report a couple of weeks ago on Brexit and poverty. And the headline conclusion was, whether we do Brexit, whether we don't do Brexit, poverty is going to get worse in the UK because that's what government policies are doing. And the lesson was, Brexit or no Brexit, government policies under a different government could do something about it. Just because we do something like Brexit that will damage our economy doesn't mean that the pain needs to be visited upon the most poor and the most vulnerable in our society as it was after the financial crisis. So whatever the outcome, a government that focuses more on creating a fair society and on implementing social democratic radical policies can certainly help to make this country a better place either way.
Thanks so much, Anand. Some really interesting stuff from all the panellists. Matt explaining the thinking behind the leadership's view of what to do after the referendum, making the point that the Tories are already trying to pin the blame. It'd be quite interesting to have a discussion about how effective, how potent the attack is on Labour for trying to thwart the will of the people, which the Tories are using more and more. Bridget, really interesting about how we've been too timid, too establishment. We need to be more optimistic and talk about the need for people's vote. My first question to you, I expect somebody else wanted to ask it, is there still time? Stephen, again, because he's plugged his book twice, we might as well do a third time, interesting on the whole cosmopolitan communitarian divide and the need for, or his preference for the Norway option, which Anand then very succinctly decided to destroy. But at least we haven't got kind of uniform thought across the panel here, and again, how would a government in a post-Brexit scenario where we are going to be economically worse off do kind of more with less? So let's throw it over to you lot. My first Brexit policy, by the way, would be automatic compulsory air conditioning at every fringe event. I'm sure I'd win that. If you want to say who you are, that would help talk. If you have a particular question for one member of the panel, can you tell me? Otherwise, I'll just pick them at random as it goes through. So I'll try and get through as many times. We haven't got quite a lot of time. Randomly, let's start with you, madam. Yeah. Have we got another microphone, by the way, or are we going to have to shout? We're going to have to shout. I'll try and relay the question.
I'm used to shouting up from Blackpool. Okay. Can you all hear? Yeah. There were three of you, actually, I'd like to ask a question to, and you used, in different ways, you used a metaphor of a lesson plan, academic stories, and I think you did as well, and you spoke about what it's like in your community. And what I'd like to ask the panel is, why are we not telling stories that people understand? Because Project Fear is making people afraid, and when you're afraid, you completely ignore what's being said, and you carry on with the statements that keep you safe, I think. And I think the other thing to say is, I have 2 passports. I scurried down and got my Irish passport because I couldn't stand the thought of not being European. And I've gone through almost a bereavement, actually, which is made better now because I've got an Irish passport. Blackpool voted out, and it's not just academic that they're going to be poorer, it's dreadful. Thank you.
You're going to have to shout, I'm afraid, to say yes, do you want to?
Me?
Yeah.
Yes, hello. I'm from Allen and Deeside CLP, and that, if the people know, is where the Airbus wing factory is.
Yes.
Now, they did vote for leave, but it was quite marginal. And my argument is that a people's vote will not be a repeat of the referendum. It'll be a 3 point question. So it'd be whether you agree with whatever negotiated deal, or you want a no-deal Brexit, or you want to remain with EU membership. So if we have an actual negotiated deal to vote upon, then all the misinformation of the campaigns will be irrelevant because people will actually know what Brexit then means. Because a lot of Leave voters were promised all sorts, you know, a Brexit of milk and honey. And particularly, I mean, the illogical sort of Leave voting you got in my constituency was people from Airbus didn't comprehend, even though the management told them they will move the factory if there's any disruption to trade. I mean, the whole thing with tariffs is not as big a deal as disruption to production lines through being held up in customs. So goods will have, if they're treated the same as importing from outside of the EU, where you have to have a customs officer, you have to be in a bonded warehouse while you pass through customs. You know, this will all increase the delay, so we require warehousing of products in order to keep your production line.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to start putting these points to the panel. They kind of dovetail neatly. Do we need a better story? Do we need a better narrative to tell? And two, if we are going to have a second referendum, can we get it down to 3 questions, or do we maybe get it up to 5 or 6? I have no idea, but it's an interesting point. I admire your optimism.
My point was that people who voted Leave now, now they know the reality, won't leave necessarily.
So, Bridget, are people better informed?
I think just generally on the issue around can it be done, is it possible to deliver it in the timescale? Yes, I do think it's possible. I think it's amazing what you can achieve with political will. If I wasn't an optimist about what we could achieve with political will, I wouldn't have joined the Labour Party. I believe that we can achieve things by working together and can achieve great things together. And yes, I think if there's the will in Parliament to put it to the people, then yes, it can be done. Just if I could just touch briefly on the issues around polling and have people change their minds. You know, when I signed up to support the People's Vote campaign with a number of colleagues from the North East who were concerned about the impact of Brexit on our community, if I'm honest, I had reservations about where it was going to take us, about whether it could be done, whether there'd be the support for it, and understandably wanting to make sure that my constituents didn't feel that I was seeking to divide or to alienate from their views. But I don't think there's been a massive shift. I'd be lying if I said I did. However, I do think there has been movement towards in the way that we would seek. But also, I think you have to look very carefully at who turns out and votes. And when we talk about Leave areas and Remain areas, the point I would make, and I'm not being facetious when I say this, people vote, areas don't vote. So Sunderland, the people in Sunderland may have voted by 62% for Leave, but that isn't necessarily fixed at any given point in time. People change their minds. That's why we have general elections every 4 or 5 years. And if we didn't believe that people could change their mind or wanted to reassess, then I'm not quite sure why we'd be calling for a general election as soon as possible either, because surely the argument we're making there is that people will look again at what the Tories are doing to our country and think differently about what a Labour government could achieve. So I don't think it need be as divisive as people suggest. I think we are a divided country. I entirely accept the point that Stephen is making. Where Labour has succeeded, it's always been where we've sought to bring the country back together. But I would be doing my constituents a disservice if I wasn't very, very clear about the consequences of where we're headed. The North East will be the worst hit part of the whole country. Thousands of people will lose their jobs in places like Nissan, very well paid, highly skilled, unionised jobs. Those jobs, not in the next couple of weeks, not in the next couple of years, and this was a failing, I think, of the way we argued for Remain. They won't go overnight. You know, people said on the 24th of June, well, you know, it was Project Fear, all these jobs haven't gone abroad. I would suggest we look at 10 years' time at where manufacturing and the automotive sector is in the North East, and then consider if allowing a Tory hard Brexit to go through is really in the best interests of working people in our country.
Quick response to Stephen, to your question, because I was thought it was interesting about the need for a kind of a better story to tell. And you talked about a new national message earlier. Didn't tell us what it was going to be. Tell us very quickly.
So, you know, I'm married to a Dane. Both of my daughters were born in Brussels. I am absolutely passionate about the value of European cooperation. of working with our partners. You know, on the back of our Labour Party membership card, it says, by the strength of our collective endeavour, I'm pro-European because I'm Labour, and I'm Labour because I'm pro-European. But I do also believe that in the integrationist surge that took place after Maastricht, many countries like the UK were left behind in terms of our democratic consent for the European project. And I think that we have to accept that. And if we're going to have a narrative about what the UK's relationship with the EU should be, it should take that as its starting point. And what I think the narrative should be is that Brexit is not only a reset moment for our country, it is for the entire European Union. Because rather than take a one-size-fits-all, top-down approach to integration, why not create a multi-tier Europe? Let's have an outer tier of countries, the UK, the Scandinavians, perhaps some of the Central and Eastern Europeans, that want a close economic relationship with the EU and all the benefits that that brings, but are never going to be in the Eurozone and are never going to be part of our national identity is not the same as the ones that signed the Treaty of Rome in 1958. They needed Europe to ride to their rescue, to save their sense of national prestige. They had just been through the humiliations of the Second World War. The whole narrative in our country is different. And I think we have to understand, those of us who are passionately pro-European, that that passion does not run across the rest of the country. It just doesn't. And the referendum, I think, demonstrated that. So I think the story has to be, this is an opportunity for a reset moment, not just for us, but for the entire European Union. And we could be the leading player in an outer ring. And if I could very, very briefly and cheekily address the issue of the vassal state. In fact, I think there are tremendous opportunities within the EEA structure. You've got the EEA Joint Committee. You've got dozens and dozens of technical and working groups. You've got observer, immediate associate status in all the EU agencies. But what's also really important, I think, is to say any negotiations with the EU, it's like building a house. You've got to agree on the basic foundations and the blueprint for the house, but you can have then a big argument about the doors and the windows and the colour of the curtains. I've never said the Norway option. It's not the Norway option. We're not Norway. But what we should have done right from the start of these negotiations is said the basic foundation for a frictionless relationship with the EU, the only one, EEA plus a customs union, that solves Northern Ireland, the only one that solves the issues of Airbus and the complex and integrated supply chains, is EEA plus a customs union. Get that foundation in place, then you can have a debate about the new structure and architecture of our relationship with the EU, looking at things like free movement of labour, looking at things like, where we've got particular comparative advantage in the EU. It's a great opportunity to have that new discussion. If you look at President Macron's speech to the Sorbonne in December, he says absolutely clearly, the EU has got it wrong. It has been too top-down, one-size-fits-all. This could be a real opportunity for a reset moment.
I will try and get through as many questions as I can. We have got time, but if you keep questions really short, that also helps. Right back in the white t-shirt, young guy there first. Yeah, yes, you.
This question for Stephen about his ideas about unifying the country after. I'd say if we don't have a people's vote or don't have a general election, we can continue on the path we're going, and we get this economic downturn. Although the political divisions that leave and remain like sort of go slightly, the economic divisions within the country between those that are worse hit, the sort of poorest in society get worse off. Surely the division between them and the rich parts of society, the Jacob Rees-Moggs, who won't be hit as hard about this, surely that division will get further. So how are we supposed to address this and actually unify the country?
You can have the mic because you're close, I can hand it to you.
Sorry for a bit of change of topic. We know from Stephen's work as an MP, particularly in the constituency of Port Talbot, that what we're dealing with, the worst end of Brexit, is incredibly vulnerable people who, as Bridget said, they're very vulnerable to economic shocks. Stephen, you know from your work that without the kind of appropriate financial regulation in place, that people can be scammed. And I just wondered if I could ask both Stephen and Bridget what your concerns are in the event of a sort of Tory Brexit, a Chequers Brexit, that will be used and hijacked for a sort of deregulatory purposes, shall we say, and what that could do to the stability of consumers and their ability to be protected.
I'll take one more the guy at the back there, you've had your arm up for a long time. Yes, you're in the doorway. Yes, I can't. Just check shirt.
Yeah, I just wanted to put the question primarily for Stephen. I totally agree with you that the EEA, the Customs Union, is the right way forward and should be Labour Party policy. However, there is an argument that having voted to leave the European Union, having regained sovereignty, we enter into a structure where we are pooling our sovereignty considerably. So it seems to me very difficult to support that policy without having it approved by the electorate. So I think you would need another vote, not a vote, shall we go back in, but simply a vote to approve the policy of the Customs Union and the EEA. And I, even though I support I find it very hard to argue against that. What's your view?
Okay, right, we'll come back. We'll get another round in. Stephen, all those same questions seem aimed at you. So, you know, can we...
I'll try and rattle through them really quickly, really quickly. On divisions and economic shock, look, I think that an EEA plus Customs Union Brexit would keep those shocks to an absolute minimum, because it, in essence, is the continuation of frictionless trade. So the economic dimension is minimised. The challenge with it is, to your question, sir, the political dimension, the sovereignty dimension, and this sort of vassal state issue. But I do think there the opportunity is to have that broader discussion with the European Union, the building of the house, rebuilding a new house based on new foundations, where you potentially create an outer ring of countries where the UK has got a leading role and a strong voice. And I think that can really help to address a lot of those issues about sovereignty and democracy. What I will say is that the only form of Brexit that I will vote for, when it comes to the meaningful vote, is an EEA plus Customs Union based Brexit. Chequers doesn't work, it's dead in the water, and clearly if we end up with no deal, absolutely no chance we're voting for that. So we have to keep the people's vote option on the table, and I agree with our front bench position on that. What I am saying is I think that there is a new way forward in terms of resetting UK's relationship with the EU, and I don't want to waste that opportunity. In terms of being scammed, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that if we end up in a hard Brexit or a no-deal Brexit, that is the dream of Jacob Rees-Mogg and everybody else, because they want to turn our country into a European version of the Cayman Islands. That's why we've got to be bound in and anchored with all of the values and all of the achievements that we've made in terms of standards for environment, consumer protection, employers' rights. We must never become untethered from them. Thank you.
Matt.
Yes, I agree with the gentleman at the front. There are some people in the Conservative Party who do want to use Brexit and the prospect of a no-deal Brexit to push through their real agenda of deregulation, low taxes, low wages. But they number about 40 in the Conservative Party. That's mainly the ERG out of 310 MPs. So I don't think they're going to have much influence over the direction of the Conservative Party. I don't think, as I said before, they're going to allow no deal to happen. And there's certainly no majority in Parliament for no deal. I do think, however, that the EEA plus Customs Union, while it is certainly better than no deal, I think anything's better than no deal, because of the economic consequences, I don't think it's something that you would really want to state is the desired objective of the negotiations, because actually it is turning Britain into a rule taker. And it's not really taking back control, and I just don't understand. I don't know why the Labour leadership would lay their cards on the table and say, "This, we want EEA, we want Customs Union." Okay, really, the Conservative Party have messed up the negotiations. If they have to take that, that's a failure. So why would you want to attach yourself to what will be a failure? So I think that's got to be taken into account as well. Sorry, I won't keep going on.
Yeah, please keep going. This is why I invited you. And Anand, very quickly.
Yeah, I just want to comment on a couple of things we've heard. Firstly, Bridget is absolutely right. One of the most sort of ironic things about Brexit, we've got a team that looks at the impact of Brexit on the different bits of the United Kingdom. And there's almost a perfect correlation between how strongly an area voted to leave and how dependent they are on trade with the European Union. It is it's the leave parts that will suffer worse from trade becoming harder with the European, apart from Northern Ireland. Apart from Northern Ireland, that's for a whole set of different reasons with the Republic. But absolutely yes, apart from Northern Ireland. Second thing I'd say is just on this notion of people of there being a sort of shift from Leave to Remain. What I would say is, yes, in the aggregate polling now, there is obviously a shift towards Remain. The polling shows that Remain has a slight lead in most of the polls. But what the evidence suggests is there's precious little changing of minds going on. That shift is almost entirely made up of people who either didn't vote in 2016 or couldn't vote because they were too young in 2016, now saying they vote Remain. The notion that lots and lots of Leavers are changing their mind isn't borne out in this. And just one final point, to come back on the gentleman from Airbus who was talking about a second referendum, and now we know what the deal will be, we can vote on it. We won't know what the deal will be. We're not getting a trade deal this autumn, we're getting a statement, a political declaration. A second referendum on what our future relationship with the European Union will be like will be an exact rerun of the first. Everyone will be talking tosh about the future, because no one actually knows what we'll be voting on because we won't have negotiated it yet. And that, it strikes me, is going to be, would be a real problem in that event.
But isn't there a deadline that it has to be negotiated by?
The withdrawal agreement, the trade agreement, might take 10 more years.
Okay, thank you, Matt.
Thanks so
So,
much.
little
Sorry,
applause
sorry
for Matt.
about that.
Yes,
Steve, I really like your sentiment of the UK moving forward together. However, I agree with what you've said. I've been campaigning for the positive way forward, speaking to Remain Leavers, and they won't listen. In fact, they make visible threats to me, call me a traitor, enemy of the people. And what we've seen in the media, which is one for the Daily Mirror in here, and other media people are in here, we've seen, I think, about 40 years of hate media in this country, using fascist-like statements. And it seems to be okay to use these things, this sort of conversation these days. I don't see any of these people wanting to go together unless they get their magic unicorn that they want, which cannot be done.
Small shout out from Mirror for actually coming out for Remain and not using that sort of racist language. Femi, you've managed to infiltrate this another event. Congratulations.
I agree with Stephen's assessment that the Brexit vote was largely to do with the divide between a very London-centric Westminster that cared primarily about like metropolitan areas and the more rural community areas, and that has to change. But for that to change, we need a message of hope. That in order to fix that, you need time, money, investment in those areas to create those jobs to actually improve the lives of the areas that voted strongest for Brexit. But right now, because all the oxygen is being taken out of the room by Brexit itself. The government has taken on 7,000 civil servants to deal with Brexit, plans for 9,000 more, 300 more to deal with the border issues. Not doctors, not nurses, not teachers. Civil servants to deal with Brexit. That is not fixing the issue, so we need to have that message of hope. And regarding what actually comes out at the end, you said there's not going to be a deal. Northern Ireland is the one bit that has to be concluded now. That's what we get to look at. And there is no way to solve that, because if Northern Ireland stays within the single market, then what's the point? We just simply given up the control, the dominant position that we have in deciding EU law. And if Northern Ireland leaves the single market, you've screwed up the Good Friday Agreement. So there will be something we can assess. It will either leave us a rule taker, a less sovereign country than EU members, or ruins the United Kingdom as an entity.
Okay, and the woman behind. So, yes, you.
Thank you. I'm Jane Thomas, I'm Sheffield Talent CLP, but I'm also been leading on the Brexit Civil Society Alliance. It's a very quick question. I think we're running out of time, and if there is going to be any delays or reversals or whatever, it's going to have to be done through Parliament. Lord Kerr produced a report last week that suggested there are 6 potential opportunities to either stop, delay, reverse. There's also an opportunity, I think, with budget and shared prosperity fund. There's lots of parliamentary interventions that are coming up, and it's actually what are our parliamentarians going to be doing, including with the meaningful vote, to really put some pressure on now, and particularly with the options that Lord Kerr, who was the architect of Article 50 in the first place.
Okay, some really good questions there. Bridget, I want to start with you on how do you get Leave people to listen? And Anand, you can answer the Northern Ireland question, because nobody else has been able to do so. But let's start with Bridget first.
So without wanting to totally rehearse what worked and what didn't work back in 2016, I think every election, every referendum is not just about, is in part about who's motivated to vote and about turnout. And I think it's very clear when I look at who voted in my community, and I think the pattern is borne out across the country, that it's a question of motivation. And I know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, there were a lot of reluctant, stay-at-home, shy Remainers, and the Leave vote was very well motivated. Now, that's something that you would have to counter in a referendum, in a people's vote. So I don't think there's been a huge, great number of people who voted Leave who've suddenly changed their minds, although I do think there has been a number of, you know, a decent number of people for whom that would fit the bill. But there have been, I think, a lot of people increasingly concerned about the direction that our country is headed in. People who I spoke to on polling day in 2016 who said, well, if I was going to go out and vote, I'd be voting Remain, but well, there's no point because Remain's going to win, it's going to be a walk in the park, isn't it? That was a fairly typical comment. Equally, people that were saying to me, with a degree of justification, it has to be said, when it comes to the shortcomings in the Labour campaign and the Remain campaign. Well, I see David Cameron on the television all the time talking about why we've got to stay in Europe, but I don't normally agree with him, so you're telling me that he's right on this one and that we've got to go along with this. Now, we didn't do half as much as we should have done. We tried at a local level, I know we tried across the country, but we need to do far, far more in the event that this goes back to the people to make the case for why jobs, livelihoods, living standards, wages, all the things that people care about will be deeply affected by Brexit. And I agree with the points that have been made about whether Brexit is really a priority for Labour voters. I think Brexit is a second or third order issue for most Labour voters. It always was, it always is. We asked people to make a choice on a binary question back in 2016, and they made their choice. But, you know, Brexit doesn't feature as much as you might think when it comes to areas, with people in areas who voted to leave. And the one point I would just make in terms of the electoral calculations around this, you can represent an area that voted by majority to leave, as I do, but that's not the same thing as Labour voters within an area voting to leave. And, you know, all of the polling that I've seen was very clear that the majority of people that sent me back to Westminster in 2017 had voted Remain, even in an area that had voted by majority to leave. Not everyone in a Labour-held constituency is a Leave voter. And I think if we have the courage of our convictions, the right message, the right arguments around hope, and the right campaign, then we can win it again. I don't pretend it will be easy. I don't pretend it's something I relish. And the 2016 referendum was awful, divisive, unpleasant. We lost a colleague during that referendum. You know, many of us do not want to go back to that. I didn't sign up to the People's Vote thinking, great, what an easy life this will be for us all, making these wonderful, easy arguments to people across the country. But it is so important for the people that I represent, because they will be the people out of work, suffering the most, seeing their wages hit, with a lack of hope for young people in my community if we get what's coming.
Anand, can you answer the Lord Kerr question? And is Northern Ireland, is it solvable, or is it just intractable?
On the Lord Kerr question, all I'd say is it makes me nervous, not constitutionally or legally, but just politically, the prospect of Parliament reversing the outcome of a referendum. I just think that is a bad look, and you know, it's possible, and obviously under our constitution Parliament is sovereign. I'm just not sure that would happen, or that parliamentarians would want that to happen. I suspect that if Brexit is going to be reversed, it has to be via another referendum, not via a parliamentary vote. On Northern Ireland, I mean, what you said is quite right. There is no solution to Northern Ireland. And I think it's worth being clear about a couple of things on Northern Ireland. One of the reasons why the government is unwilling to accept an internal UK border isn't just because of the DUP. You know, there are many anti-Brexit, moderate Conservative MPs who've said publicly, I can never vote for this backstop because I won't divide my own country. And the other side, as you quite rightly said, is the EEA option, which again I think Parliament will struggle to vote for because of what it implies in terms of, at this point, I mean, Stephen's right, there might be a scope for renegotiating the agreement. I think at this point in the negotiations we've left it a bit late. But if, you know, signing up to EEA now, with all that it implies in terms of freedom of movement, I can't see Parliament doing that either. So all we can hope for, I suppose, is some incredibly creative drafting in the withdrawal agreement. Now, how you do that, God alone knows, but it needs to be drafting that satisfies the Irish that the backstop will be used and satisfies the Tories that it won't. It's going to take a better man than me to draft that, but ultimately that seems to me to be the only way we're going to get out of this.
Right, let's take some more. I'll try and get around as many as possible. Yes, you've been waiting very patiently. Do you want to use the microphone as you're here?
It's Masato Kimura, Japanese journalist and a member of Labour Party now. And so my question is cross-party cooperation. So I think general election, the second referendum, it's fine idea, but time is running out. If in the last minute you need to avoid no deal Brexit, there is any possibility of cross-party cooperations with Conservative?
That's very good. Yes?
It was said earlier that we can't actually have people's vote on final negotiations because they won't be finished for a long time. But shouldn't we at least have a people's vote on what kind of Brexit we want, whether it's a no deal, very unlikely, or a soft deal, or a hard deal? Like, kind of Brexit should surely have a people's vote on it, even if not the specifics of the negotiation.
And the woman right at the back, yes.
Yes, two things worry me a lot. One is that under the EEA, I believe they would have to implement 21% of all EU laws unless that's been changed and I've missed it, which includes justice and home affairs. And one of the major things that really, really worries me is the number of amendments that got through Parliament with under 25 votes because of the way it's set up, which gives this current government horrendous powers to just change things without us even knowing them.
Excellent, thank you very much. Stephen, do you trust some of these Conservative colleagues you've been trying to work with on Brexit, or have you now decided that they're kind of lily-livered and kind of flake at the last moment, fold at the last moment?
Well, I think in terms of the way it's going to work in Parliament, you know, there's so many assumptions that we have to make now. One would be, is Theresa May going to come back with a deal? If she comes back with a deal that somehow resembles Chequers, which seems unlikely because the European Union has dismissed that, it doesn't seem to me that there's a parliamentary majority because the 40 kamikaze extremists will vote against it, then I think she doesn't have the numbers. And that's when we get into the territory of her, potentially the government saying the only way we get out of this is by putting it back to the people. And she may well put it back to the people saying, well, it's either no deal or remain in the European Union. But there is another way through this, at the risk of me sounding like a broken record, to the point on parliamentary cooperation. I mean, we had an EEA amendment from the Lords recently. 76 Labour MPs voted for it in defiance of the whip. I think it's the biggest rebellion in the history of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Now, if we'd been whipped in favour of that, the entire front bench would have voted for it as well, and lots of other backbenchers who would have followed the whip. And then you're well above 200 Labour MPs voting for it. And in my opinion, there's at least half of the Conservative Parliamentary Party that would vote for it. I mean, we've been in conversations with Anna Soubry, Stephen Hammond, Nick Bowles, James Cartledge, a number of so-called One Nation Tories who I think are in favour of this option, and they're basically seeing it as a plan B. So I think their plan is to try and see what the Prime Minister finally comes back with following the summit in November, and then come forward with this as a plan B, because the alternative is either a people's vote, which I don't think commands any support on the Tory benches, or going crashing out with no deal at all, which also commands no support. So it's a way of navigating through. Just a final point on this issue of whether or not Labour should be articulating a position and a policy. And I've heard these, I mean, certain people on the front bench have been quoting Napoleon, you know, the famous quote, never interrupt your enemy when they're fighting amongst themselves. I have to say that is not an acceptable position, in my opinion. If you are serious about being a party of government, you don't only oppose, you also are able to answer the question, well, what would you do? And the big difference with Napoleon, of course, was, yes, he waited whilst his enemies were fighting amongst themselves, but he always had a plan. And the 6 points, you know, our 6 tests, that's fine in terms of what we want to achieve, but you have to also say how you're going to get there in a realistic framework that is going to work with the European Union. Throughout these negotiations, I fear that the leadership of all political parties have underestimated the unity and discipline and organisation of the European Union. These guys are not messing around. They're not, this isn't a game to them. When Michel Barnier says this isn't going to work, he's not just saying that for the good of his health, he means it. So we have to have an alternative vision and plan, and I think there's a real risk that we're going to fall into a trap when she comes back with some kind of deal and we vote against it purely because we will be framed as saying, well, we just want a general election, and here's the Labour Party putting the party ahead of the country. And I think there's a real risk we'll fall into that trap if we don't have a clear and compelling vision and narrative for what we think Brexit should look like.
Anand, can you answer the questions on the EA and what sort of form should any people's vote take? What would be the ideal question?
What was the question on the EA?
It was back.
Oh, the 21% of laws.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the EEA agreement doesn't cover the whole of the EU agreement, which is why the proportion is going to be smaller, as the EEA only applies to part of the acquis. So, I mean, as Stephen was saying, some of the more political parts of the European Union, where there is still EU law, don't apply within the EEA framework. So I'd imagine that is why. I mean, the big issue for me is, are you in the room to vote? Not are you in the room to negotiate, but ultimately do you get a vote? And that strikes me as the problematic element. It's very interesting, if you talk to the Swiss ambassador's on a bit of a crusade at the moment to try and turn Britain into another Switzerland with regard to relations with the EU. And he just said, my country would never tolerate the EEA. We don't like that sort of subservience. Now, you can take that as you will, but I think there will be we can argue about this over and over again.
I'm sure we will.
The danger of a political problem there. On the referendum question, I mean, yes, in an ideal world, you would lay out various trade treaty alternatives and say which would you want to vote on. There are two problems with that, it seems to me. One, because this is a negotiation with another party, the government can't guarantee that any of them will be available until we've had the negotiation with the European Union. The second is I dread to think what the turnout would be on a vote that was as complicated and technical as that. I mean, that's the real problem here, is as soon as you start messing about and having various options, and the more technical you make it, the lower the turnout is going to be, because it will just turn people off. And so I'm not sure how feasible that is. I think basically, in the event of another referendum, the question needs to be very simple. The only issue is what that question is, because at the moment, as you see, there are people in the Labour Party saying, yes, we should have a second vote, but Remain shouldn't be an option, which strikes me as a slightly illogical position, I have to say.
Right. More questions? The young guy there with the stripy t-shirt.
So I'm sure that maybe recently there was polling that suggested that 86% of Labour members would support a vote on the outcome of Brexit, and 90% would vote Remain if there were to be another referendum. So Stephen talked about uncertainty in government from the general public, but does the Labour Party believe that its members will continue to trust it if it appears to ignore them?
I remember the war, but I also remember the Cold War and the contribution that the EU has made, not just in bringing those who were in the western part, but also Eastern European countries, and the way that so many countries have been transformed because of the political role of the EU. Now, I also remember the last referendum, and we talked then arrogantly about giving leadership to Europe. That is not the way to do it. But what we could think about, is there any mileage in talking about the contribution that Britain has made to the institutions of Europe? I think in terms of justice, I think it's not just money that we have given, but also wisdom that have brought results. Because I would like to see a really positive campaign, not that we go in with great pride, but with humility, saying the things that we could do. And those rules that are no catching us out, we agreed to all of them. Almost everything that we have, I think it's 97% of the votes in the EU committees, we agreed to. So we are being caught out by the rules that we helped to make. So is there some mileage in?
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. I've got a very sore throat, I'm sorry. So I think, and many other people have said, that all of the options, Sweden, Norway, Canada, Canada Plus, none of them are as good as the deal we've got now. We have the rebate, we're not in Schengen, but we have a much better deal now than any of the deals I think we're going to get. I agree with you that I don't think Parliament can possibly reverse the decision, but I think if we genuinely believe that what we have now is worse than all of the other options we can go for, then surely we have to go for a people's vote. And you seem to have some concerns about that and say, well, it's not as easy as all that. But I think you're right, we have to work very hard to persuade the people of the benefits of staying where we are. But I think we need a people's vote to do it.
Great questions again. Bridget, do you want to pick up on this kind of what is the electoral price to Labour of either, failing to support a second vote or ruling one out? Because it, it swings both ways and there's conflicting arguments of polling on all this issue. What's your view on this one?
I think the picture across the country is complex. So the gains that we made in the 2017 general election were in places that tended to be younger, more liberal in outlook, university educated people. They're the seats that we'll need to hold on to, and we'll need to then make further gains in other parts of the country that don't fit that narrative, at the same time as holding onto seats that have started to move away from us, and also taking back many of those seats that actually we've continued to drift away from since 2010. I think that's far bigger than Brexit. I think Brexit is symptom and not cause of some of the electoral difficulties that we face. I think there are lots of reasons why people who voted for us up until 2010 have moved away from us and have not yet returned. And whatever we say about a people's vote, our position on Europe, our party policy, it must go hand in hand with a bigger narrative about the future that we have for our country. We've only ever succeeded as a party when we've been able to unite the Hampstead and the Hull, the working people in towns like Sunderland, and also liberal kind of people in big cities in London and elsewhere. We've always been that electoral coalition. That's the way the Labour Party wins. Now, I think we can be there again, but I think we need to be clear that Brexit need not be the inevitable divide, I think, that it is being painted as. Because I think for most Labour voters in places like Sunderland, yes, of course they want to know what we've got to say about Brexit. As I said, the majority of people that re-elected me in 2017 had voted Remain in the referendum the year before. But they also want to know what we've got to say about investment in infrastructure, about how we tackle child poverty, about how we secure better, well-paid jobs for young people in the future. So it all has to go hand in hand. The difficulty I think that we face on the people's vote is that we will rightly be arguing that it should go back to the people, for the people to decide our relationship with Europe. But unless we're very clear about how we would change and transform Britain alongside that relationship with Europe, I think it will be far more difficult for us to win. And I don't think Labour voters and Labour members are that far apart on many of these issues, just to respond to the question from the man there. And I agree with the point that was raised. We are not going to get anything that is better than we have now. We have many benefits that come from what we've managed to negotiate over the years, and we're likely to lose a significant amount. No trade deal with the US, no trade deal elsewhere is going to replicate the benefits that people in Sunderland feel by the seamless, easy export and market access that we have, that means we can ship 500,000 cars around the world, the majority of them into the European markets, very, very easily. And if we make that harder in any way, we will gradually start to see jobs going elsewhere. Now, that's not just those nearly 7,000 people that work at Nissan, it's the 25,000 people across the North East whose jobs depend on it. And I'm not sure that Labour voters or voters anywhere will thank us and will say to me, thanks very much for delivering a Brexit I didn't want and I didn't vote for, you've put me out of work. I'm not sure there'll be great munificence from the public if that's the outcome of what we as politicians do or don't achieve in the months ahead.
Very quickly, Stephen, can you ask this gentleman's excellent question about the institutions of Europe, our kind of failure in this country so often to actually explain the significance of kind of the EU as part of European history and the Great Peace? And as you seem to be the most qualified person by a long way on this, is you're going to be almost uber-European in terms of your heritage.
Thank you, Jason. Look, I want to make it absolutely clear that the only form of Brexit that I would vote for in Parliament is the one that I have set out. And if the whole House of Cards comes crashing down and we end up in a people's vote, I will be campaigning, and it's a choice between no deal and staying in the European Union. I will be campaigning with my heart and soul for staying in the European Union. But what I see is an opportunity for delivering a Brexit which delivers frictionless trade, which keeps us in a customs union, which delivers on the single market, which keeps the Northern Ireland border, protects the terms of the Good Friday Agreement, but also moves us into a space where we actually have some democratic consent and support for our relationship with the European Union. I am a whole nation politician to my fingertips. I believe that the purpose of politics is to unite people, to build cohesive communities, to build a nation that can actually work together and have a civil conversation with it. Remember one of those? Remember the last time that our country was actually involved in a civilized debate? Brexit has poisoned the well. Our relationship with the European Union has poisoned the well of our politics for decades. And we do have to recognise that we can't just pretend that we can go back to what it was and expect not to draw the poison from that well. So I think that there is an opportunity to build a whole nation politics if we get this right, and I'm very concerned that another referendum will do precisely the opposite. In terms of what the UK has delivered and achieved, absolutely. I mean, the expansion of the European Union, bringing the soft power of the European Union is what drove growth and the transition to liberal democracy and the transition to a regulated market economy in all of the former countries of the communist bloc. And that is a huge achievement, and the United Kingdom was a driver of that. So we should never forget about what we've done in terms of the geopolitical role and the soft power of the European Union, but we also have to recognise that there is at least, I mean, in his book, The Road to Somewhere, David Goodhart talks about somewheres and anywheres, and in many ways what we talk about in our book, communitarians and cosmopolitans, is the same. He estimates that the country is about 60%, 65% communitarian, and the rest cosmopolitans. And we have to be very careful that we don't sit in a cosmopolitan bubble and not understand what is going on out there in those communities. And they don't care all that much about the soft power that the EU, they don't, I think if you scratch below the surface, they will say, what matters to me is my lived experience. And all of these experts told me that it would be disastrous to leave the EU. And you know what? They believed Michael Gove when he said, we've had enough of experts. I'm not saying that that's right, but it is the reality of the world that we're living in. So what I want to do is try and have a compelling narrative for the future of our relationship with the European Union, which, yes, absolutely values the immensely important role that it's played, and that keeps us in a close and constructive and productive relationship, but also recognises the lack of democratic consent that we have for it in many, many of our communities across the length and breadth of our country.
Okay, we've got time for one more round with votes. This gentleman here has been very patient. Yes.
I think we need to get real about where we are. We're a few weeks away from where decisions have got to be made. The Labour Party campaigned to remain in the EU, and pretty much everywhere, and you think we should remain in the EU. The only way we can stop a Tory government delivering a Tory Brexit, it needs 66% of the Commons, doesn't it, to vote for a general election. It needs 51%, I would guess, to vote and press the government to force them to get a people's vote. If we want to stop the disaster of Brexit, then it's only through the people's vote that we're going to do it. There's no other choices.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. I've been wanting to talk since. Thank you. My name is Pauline. I'm from Streatham constituency, CLP. My constituency, my people voted overwhelmingly for Remain, and if not even more than Gibraltar. And I'm a councillor in any ward. Any ward, we voted for Remain. We believe in democracy, which is the government of the people, for the people. Apart from that, we have a human right. The fundamental human right is a right of choice. Our people, the British people, were deceived into voting Brexit. Okay? The Leave campaign, for example, has claimed that 350 million weekly costs of the EU will be used to maintain, like NHS. We know one of the best thing we did in 1948 was establishing the NHS that the Tory are now trying to take over. They can never take over. Okay. The fact of it is that if we do not give our people the chance to vote again, we have a chance to change our mind. Now that they know the fact, assumption is dangerous. For the fact that, sorry sir, forgotten your name, that you are assuming what will happen. But why do we assume? Why don't we go for it and give our people the chance now that they know? Because a lot of people, the margin is so slim. A lot of people were deceived into it. If we can go by the Roman law, okay, people like Michael Farage or what's his name should be crucified. Please, what will happen to the NHS? What are we thinking about the NHS if we don't allow our people to vote?
I need to get other questions.
Thank you.
That was lovely. Thank you very much. The black top with his hand up.
The reason why I'll be honest, I voted out was because in Europe at the moment there should be a real bubbling underneath it all, fascism. And I don't fancy sitting around a table with a lot who think Hitler was the greatest things in sliced bread. So I thought that's why I voted out, because I didn't want another little short-ass bugger with a moustache trying to cause another war. So that's why I voted out. Because that's what's happening in you. You look at all the countries, they're all bubbling underneath, they're all getting very, you know, it's like a plague under the skin. You want to run away from that? Well, I don't want to run away from it. No, I'll fight it. Socialism internationalist. What's the United Nations for? The United Nations never stopped the war.
Shall we let them bow, not us? Yeah, that's what they're here for. Yeah. Have you changed your mind at all, sir, or not?
No.
Okay, that's good. It's interesting. Right. Just trying to gauge whether you're going to, not completely in the main room. It's just interesting. Stephen, is there a bit of fear of short-ass buggers running around if we go back into the EU?
Well, look, I mean, I think that when you look at people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, it is deeply worrying. You look at the fact that Marine Le Pen got such a huge share of the vote in France in the first round, and you see the drift to the right across the Netherlands, many other countries. But we're here in this room and at this conference because we will fight tooth and nail against everything that those people stand for. And in fighting tooth and nail involves being there, it involves standing up and fighting against their messages of hate and division. Now, we've got to ensure that we have policies in place in terms of each one of our national governments that can change our countries for the better. And for me, that means working hand in hand with our brothers and sisters across the social democratic parties of the European Union to have the policies in place that will actually bring those communities back. One of the reasons that the Farages and the Le Pens and the Geert Wilders are doing so well is because the people that they're appealing to feel that they have been ignored and left behind for decades by mainstream politicians. This idea that globalization is just a force of nature. There was an era-defining speech by Tony Blair in 2005. We achieved huge things between 1997 and 2010, but in party conference in 2005, Tony said, I hear people debating about globalization. Well, you might as well debate whether the autumn follows the summer. And I think that's wrong. I think that globalization is not a force of nature. Globalization is something that we have to harness and apply our democratic values and principles to it and regulate it and turn it into an opportunity and not a threat. And the absence of an industrial strategy in this country, the absence of investment in communities like mine, decisions that were made led, in the end, were major underlying causes of the Brexit vote. So I think what's really important is we don't just engage with Brexit and find a solution to where we are now to get us out of this mess. We must also engage with the deeper underlying causes of Brexit. Brilliant work done by the IPPR. our radical and compelling manifesto. Those are the policies that we need to put in place to get investment going back into our communities, so that those communities actually can have some faith again in mainstream politics. That's the way to defeat the populists and the nationalists and their message of hate and division.
And now this is probably your last contribution, so do you want to kind of address the question of, were people deceived? And I'm going to put the same question to Bridget afterwards as well. And if they were deceived, how do you win people now by telling them that?
Thanks. Well, there's a couple of things I want to say. On the deceit, yeah, I mean, there was a lot of deceit in the campaign. The 350 million figure is wildly misleading. But as you say, going to people and saying, you were conned, let me tell you how to be smarter next time round, isn't going to make them change their votes. And I think it's important just to understand that Leave voters don't necessarily think they've got it wrong. And insofar as many of them see negative consequences coming out of Brexit, they see that as proving their point. As in, they see the negative consequences of Brexit being the result of the European Union trying to screw us, which kind of confirms to them everything they once thought. So the argument needs to be quite a subtle one to get people to change their minds on this. And not think simply that anything bad that comes out of this is because the European Union is being unreasonable, so we're probably better off out. So you know, it is just worth underlining the fact that in the event that there is another referendum, what we're voting on will not be clear to anyone. I mean, to people who voted Remain and think we should have voted Remain first time round, it might be very, very clear, but to people who voted Leave, A, where we're heading won't be clear, and B, that it was a bad decision in the first place won't be clear either. So it will take a lot of thought. Can I just say one thing very, very quickly on this story issue, which we've talked about a few things. I think the problem over narrative is far, far more profound than the narrative about our engagement with Europe. I think for decades now, the narrative about Britain's place in and relationship with the world has been wildly misleading, because you know, successive generations of politicians have exaggerated the degree to which Britain is able to do things by itself. The fact of the matter is, Britain is a medium-sized power that depends on other countries for its security, for its trade, for the safety and of its environment. And actually, you know, the bottom line is, being in something like the European Union is, to some extent at least, an admission of weakness. It is an admission of the fact that actually there's stuff we can't do by ourselves, and so we need to do it with others. And the problem with our political narrative about the outside world is the British people just haven't heard anything along those lines. What? There's stuff we can't do by ourselves? Don't be ridiculous.
You're talking the country down.
Yeah, and exactly, you're talking the country down, you're sort of not being patriotic, but actually, for me, this is simply a question of having to face up to reality. European states will do more working together than they will doing it individually.
And finally, Bridget, a question which we've kind of been reflecting a lot, which is, you know, the case to staying in the EU is rational, but people in more than ever now are voting emotionally. And I'm just wondering how you get around that problem, and how do you kind of actually appeal to our hearts as well as our heads?
I mean, I agree that I don't think it's a helpful means of approaching it to suggest that just people were conned, and if only they'd kind of understood better, then you know, things would have been different. I don't think that's a helpful way to respond to the issue, or to treat voters who are, you know, sensible people who reach decisions of their own accord. And there are lots of mistakes that were made in the 2016 referendum. We don't need to go through all of those again, but I think just to go back to the wider issues around how we unite our country and the way forward. You know, I'm someone from a part of the world that has lots of very proud, strong traditions, and I'm really proud of what my community has achieved. I'm proud of what we've achieved, but we don't live in the past, and we can't live in our history. And pride in what we've achieved in the past is not hopeful vision for what we can achieve for the future. And I don't think nostalgia gets us very far as a political strategy. Now, the difficulty with, I think, some of the way it's approached in terms of having a vision for Britain post-Brexit is that some of the talk around communitarianism is actually a drift backwards rather than an approach that takes us forwards. So, you know, going back to those days, it's often a 1950s style vision, which actually has, in some ways, a degree in common with some of the arguments, I think, that were made around the status quo by Brexiteers, ironically enough. For many people growing up in, you know, tightly knit communities where there were jobs available as soon as you left school at 15, there was a degree of certainty about all of that, and the world has changed, and that's very, very unsettling for people. But we can't go back to the past, and for many people, we wouldn't seek to go back to the past. That wasn't as great a world to grow up in if you were a woman who wanted to go to university, or you wanted to forge your own way in the world. For many people, it was a social, cultural, and economic prison. So I don't think we should imagine that everything that went before was wonderful and that everything that will come in future is terrible. I'm an optimist in politics, and I think our best days are ahead of us and not behind us. And I think that's the kind of vision that we need for Britain, which is rooted in the changes that we can make and our government can make here, not just what we can do as part of a wider European Union. Globalisation, the scale and pace of that change is different, markedly different. But, you know, being from a shipbuilding community doesn't really lend itself to a parochial outlook on life. We have always sent goods, people, halfway around the world. The church that I grew up attending was built to serve those Irish migrants who came to our community in the 19th centuries to work in those growing industries of chemicals, of shipbuilding, of coal mining. The challenge that we face as a party for the future is how we embrace that change, create new jobs in the knowledge economy of the future, rather than looking backwards. Now, I'm hopeful we can do that, and I'm also hopeful that we can change people's minds on the people's vote and on the need for us as a country to play our full part in a changed and changing European structure. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we've run out of time. A particular thanks to Bridget and to Stephen, to Anand and UK in a Changing Europe who have hosted this. Anand's asked me to plug they're on Twitter at UK and EU, and their website, which is www.ukandeu.ac.uk. It's got a wealth of information. I plunder it frequently and pass it off as my own. I highly recommend it. If you want to learn more about Brexit, it's all there. But particular thanks to you for such great questions and putting up with such a hot, sticky room. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.